Hi, I'm Chloe. I'm a dietitian. I've worked in the NHS for over 10 years, and I also run my business, the Calm Gut Dietitian. I specialise in gut health, but I'd say more now I specialise in MCAS and histamine intolerance. So my journey with this condition really started when my husband was diagnosed about 6 years ago. And then he got long COVID last year and got POTS with it, and his MCAS got worse. So I started my business mid through last year, just to try and help others that have the condition, because it can be so challenging, and really to help teach other professionals as well to help support those with the condition.
So I already mentioned I'm Joy and I lead the charity Mast Cell Action. So I've been working in the charity sector for about 10 years. My real passion is community support and engagement. I think that's what it's all about for me. That's why we're here. And so I work with an incredible team of volunteers, and we're always looking for more people to join our team. So feel free to shout if you think it might be fun to come and work with us. And we really do enjoy making a difference for people with MCAS. But also I have MCAS and I've got 2 children with MCAS as well. My children are now 13 and 12, and so I have first-hand experience of living with MCAS, and actually with my daughter with a very complex situation, which Lily took 7 years to diagnose, but I'll talk a bit more about that later on. So what is MCAS? We are obviously going to give more detail a little bit later on, but we wanted to start with the basics because MCAS can be really complex and really difficult to understand. So for those of you who may have picked up bits and pieces along the way, hopefully this will help to fill in some of those gaps that there might be. So MCAS is an immune disorder, and the mast cells are activated by triggers such as food or chemicals in your environment. And that leads to a wide variety of symptoms which affect multiple parts of the body. MCAS can start suddenly, or it can come on gradually, and it often gets worse over time. And treatment is a combination of self-management and medication. Mast cells are a type of blood cell that are found in all parts of the body, and they're a key part of our immune systems. So they detect different types of triggers and they tell the other immune cells how to respond. So we might think of them as the police officers of the immune system, looking for signs of trouble, and then when they see them, calling for backup to deal with the trigger that they're spotting. So mast cell mediators, and this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. So the triggers that affect a mast cell can then cause a release of chemicals called mast cell mediators. So you can see the image on the right here. Inside the mast cell, we have the little granules, the little tiny granules. There's hundreds of different mediators in there. And when they degranulate, so they burst and out come these chemicals, that mast cell mediator release is what causes the symptoms that we experience with MCAS. So the mast cell mediators are stored in granules inside the cell, and then they're released in very large amounts when needed. And some of these you will be aware of, such as histamine and tryptase, but there are obviously lots of different mediators. A number of mediators and the variety of them is why we all experience different symptoms and experience things differently when we have MCAS. So you can also see on the screen here a resting mast cell, an activated mast cell, and then a degranulating mast cell. You can see the tiny droplets bursting out of the mast cell there, which is all the mast cell mediators being released. And if you are interested, there's some really great videos to watch on YouTube of mast cells degranulating under a microscope. They're actually really beautiful, purple. Obviously, they cause lots of damage and upset at times for people with MCAS, but they are quite beautiful to see. So how is MCAS diagnosed? So the diagnostic criteria currently is that you need to have symptoms affecting 2 or more parts of the body, symptoms that improve with MCAS medication, mast cell mediators found at high levels in blood or urine tests, and other diagnoses excluded. And we'll talk a little bit more about each of these as we go through. So the symptoms of MCAS are really wide-ranging. They affect more than one body system. So no two people are experience the same set of symptoms. So this obviously is very difficult for people, you know, trying to understand their own symptoms, and if they maybe, you know, could this be MCAS, and they're having conversations with others who have very different symptoms. Symptoms also change over time, and they will often increase, so starting with 1 or 2 symptoms but increasing to have lots more, and they can wax and wane. So if you look at our little people down here with the orange dots, that's reflective of how the symptoms may change. So it may be, you know, a small cluster of symptoms, and then actually something quite severe, and then maybe not so much, and then it worsens again. And we often find that these flares affect people with MCAS. So you can find more information about symptoms on our website, and the different symptoms that people often experience. So the most common symptoms experienced in people with MCAS, so this was a survey that was completed by the Mast Cell Activation Society in 2019. 8 out of 10 people with MCAS reported having fatigue, chemical or medical intolerances, multiple food intolerances, brain fog and abdominal pain. And 7 out of 10 people experienced flushing, muscle pain or stiffness, joint pain, hay fever, itching or bloating. And with 6 out of 10 people, they experienced blood pressure changes, nasal congestion and itching, lightheadedness or fainting, and diarrhea. So this obviously isn't representative of everyone with MCAS, but it's actually quite interesting to give us an idea of the typical symptoms that people are experiencing. And this is my family. So my daughter, who is now 13, was diagnosed at the age of 7. My son was diagnosed at the age of 10, and I was diagnosed at 36. So we have very different symptoms, very different, quite different treatments. And we all had elevated urine tests for the mast cell mediators, but with different mediators and at different levels. And I've included this slide just to represent that even with an obvious genetic link, the symptoms that we've experienced have been very different, and the treatments that we've needed have been very different. And actually some of the treatments that are tolerated by one of us are not tolerated at all by another. Some of the key triggers for one of us are actually a way to find relief for another. So for example, my daughter, when she's really itchy, she needs to be in water. She finds that really helpful and soothing. Whereas for my son, water makes him itch. So he needs to avoid being in the water or he'll be causing that symptom. So for us, it's been really important to isolate and identify our individual symptoms and triggers, and look and work with our doctors to find the right treatments for each of us. And it is really complicated trying to do that tracking. It's complicated enough doing it for one person. So with 3 of us, you know, trying to remember what's okay for each of us and find places that we can all be safe is quite complicated. But I hope this will help to represent the differences that can be experienced, and that really, you know, comparing ourselves to other people isn't always helpful. It's just about looking at the symptoms that we are experiencing and the triggers that we need to avoid. So we've recently developed a symptoms log, which is now on the website under the self-management resources section. So you can go on and download it. It's got tracking systems where you can record your key symptoms and how much they're bothering you. And you can also record the number of different triggers that you suspect might be causing symptoms, so that you can track everything. And then there's also front sheets that you can use to share information with doctors. And the idea is that this log will help you to be able to identify the triggers that are causing symptoms, because if you can start to do that and then be able to avoid some of those symptoms, you may find that you get some relief and some overall stability there. That is something you can be doing at home. And then finally, anaphylaxis. So obviously we know that one of the symptoms of MCAS is anaphylaxis. We know our ABCs, so the airways, breathing and circulation. It is a serious allergic reaction. Obviously, if you experience this, it's an emergency, and you call 999 and state anaphylaxis, whether or not you have EpiPens. But what is often different with MCAS is people don't always present in the same way, and there are there is a range of different symptoms experienced within MCAS, so it might be useful to familiarise yourself with the different presentations of anaphylaxis so that you're prepared just in case that does happen. Whoops.
So there's lots and lots of different MCAS triggers, and it's not just food that can cause, I put your histamine bucket to overflow, but as Joy explained, it's all of those chemicals to overflow. So things like insect bites, pollens, infections, temperatures, stress, all of those things can come together and create a perfect storm. I always talk about the time I went on honeymoon with my husband, and he was drinking alcohol, we were eating loads of high histamine foods, he got a load of insect bites and then was really, really poorly. Whereas if you take on one of these factors out of the equation, then actually he might not have been so ill and had such a massive reaction. So things do come together in the perfect storm. You know, you can do so much with removing dietary triggers, but if you're still exposed to one of these other triggers, environmental triggers, then you can still have symptoms. Hormones is a massive one, so we see a lot of women who have MCAS that are going through the menopause, or who it's their time of the month and get much worse symptoms then. So there's many other different factors, and it's trying to track those, like Joy said, which can be really complicated. So I spend every day talking about the histamine bucket theory. So you can think of your body as an empty bucket, and different foods and activities are going to fill your histamine bucket at different speeds. So diet may be one of them. So some people with MCAS, which I will talk about later, have to follow a low histamine diet or eliminate other dietary triggers for them. And if it was pollen season, for example, if that was one of your environmental triggers, pollen and your response to that would fill the histamine bucket, let's say 3/4 full, leaving a very small section for dietary triggers before your bucket overflows and it causes symptoms. If it was outside of pollen season, that bucket wouldn't have been filled so much by that environmental trigger, and you might be able to eat a wider variety of foods. So it's really assessing everything else that's going on at that particular time, and therefore your triggers may change. How much of the trigger you can deal with may change depending on all those other factors.
Is this me, Chloe?
It's not on your slide split.
Okay, I think this slide has snuck in, but we'll just briefly cover it. So basically, there are lots of different medications which can be used to treat MCAS. And most people find that a trial and error approach is the right method for them. So we always recommend speaking to your medical professionals before taking any medication. But the typical treatments which are used are H1 and H2 blockers, so they're the histamine blockers, and you can access those over the counter. They're the sorts of medications you take for having hay fever or kind of seasonal allergies. And then sodium chromoglycate, so we move into mast cell stabilizers, and ketotifen, which again can help with antihistamines. And then there's other over-the-counter medications which can help, and I think, Chloe, you talk about those a little bit later on with the DAO enzymes. There's more information about medications and treatment on our website, but the most important thing to remember is that it's completely unique. So there's no trial and error, there's no one size fits all approach. It really is trial and error for you. You can't look at what's worked for somebody else and then replicate that. It has to be something you work through alone with your medical team. One of the really important things which took me a while to realize when we were first at the beginning of this journey is that sometimes the additives or preservatives in medications can trigger symptoms. So where you may think you don't tolerate fexofenadine, for example, it could be that actually you don't tolerate the dye that's in one of those brands of medication, and that you may tolerate another brand. So having a sort of open mind, keeping records of what you're reacting to and the different brands that you've tried, and having those conversations with your doctors can also be useful as well. And then testing for MCAS. So there are tests available, blood tests and also urine tests. So the blood tests that are normally undertaken are the tryptase tests. This is normal in most people with MCAS. However, it is usually elevated with HATS, which is hereditary alpha tryptasemia. Urinary tests, we're seeing more positive response to, as long as people are handling the sample correctly, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So in the urinary test sample, they're looking for N-methylhistamine and prostaglandins D2 and F2A. So elevated results are suggestive of or supportive of a diagnosis, but normal results don't rule out MCAS. Some of the mediators which we're looking for in the testing start to degrade at a very low level. So I think histamine is something like 60 seconds from leaving the body, it begins to degrade. So if that sample isn't handled correctly and refrigerated and then frozen, it may be that the results are not going to be suggestive of a diagnosis. So when we do the collection, it should be in a clean, preservative and acid-free container, and it should be collected for a period of 24 hours. So the sample always starts with your second urination of day 1 and then finishes with the first of day 2. And this container, the container used for the sample has to be refrigerated before sampling, and then it's kept refrigerated throughout. And we then would collect the sample in a different container, so for example a jug, which we'd refrigerate with the sample until it cools, and then it can be added to the main container. And then when it's being transported and stored, you should be using ice packs and a cool bag, and then obviously that would then be transported frozen to the labs in Sheffield. There is information about this on our website, and we're producing a PDF guide for doctors who are interested in trialing the testing to give them the information about collecting the sample with the best chance of a successful result. And then co-morbidities. So we know that there are often other conditions associated with MCAS. We don't know why. We don't have much information about how or why these fit together, but we do know that more research is needed and to be able to understand the link between those. The most common ones you'll hear are probably EDS, which is Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, POTS, which is postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, and MCAS. That's quite often a triad that people will experience, but by the point of a diagnosis or a suspected diagnosis of MCAS, many people will have a collection of diagnoses, and some of them are revealed on this slide.
Me.
Yeah, I think this is you, Chloe, is it?
Fine, I can do this, that's fine. So how can MCAS be managed? So at present, there's no cure for MCAS, unfortunately. The aim of treatment really is to reduce the frequency and severity of symptoms. So many people that I see almost have a bit of a roller coaster of symptoms. There are times when they're really stable, and then times where they do have flare-ups. So it's trying to minimize those flare-ups and control them as much as possible. So self-management is key. By using the word self-management, hopefully you're not on your own. You are getting lots of support, and Mast Cell Action are there as well in terms of support. However, identifying your own personal triggers really is key. So looking at all those things that we talked about, all those other factors, not just food, and trying to avoid or reduce exposure to triggers. And really talking about MCAS as well. So it's one of those things that a lot of people don't talk about, a lot of people don't understand, whereas the more I think we talk about it, the more we're going to help that understanding and help people support you as well. And you know, if you explain your condition to people, hopefully they'll be really supportive in terms of food and environment, in terms of supporting you. And medical management, so using those medications to reduce the symptom severity and frequency of those flares. So elimination diets. So there is no official diet for MCAS, although the majority of people with MCAS that I see generally do follow low histamine diets or remove some high histamine foods from their diets. There are other diets that people follow, and some people find they have to remove more than one food chemicals, so things like salicylates, oxalates, glutamates. But really, you know, it really is individual. So some people can tolerate some histamine. Some people, you know, when they're in a flare-up or are really struggling with symptoms, can only manage, you know, 3 or 4 foods. So each one of you will be on a completely different journey with your diet. When we're talking about elimination diets, we're talking about removing the food group for a period of 6 weeks. However, when I see clients, I generally try and do it for as short as possible, so sort of 2 to 4 weeks. There's very little evidence around the length of time that should be done for, but I do see people becoming slightly more sensitive to foods when they try to reintroduce them. So I think keeping it as short as possible is more beneficial in terms of trying to get you to have a more balanced, wide, varied diet in the long run. And then the reintroduction of foods one by one to see if there's a reaction to an individual food is really important. So I'm going to go through what the low histamine diet is and all the foods that it contain, but just to give an example, is individual response to each high histamine food can be really different. So my husband reacts to sourdough bread to the point of his blood pressure dropping and us calling an ambulance, which for a paramedic just isn't great. Whereas I have clients that tolerate sourdough bread absolutely fine. So you can't tell just by saying someone has MCAS, you can't eat this food, you can't eat that food. It really is trying to guide people through these elimination diets, and they can be really restrictive. So doing it with someone for support, ideally a dietitian trained in these diets, is really important. However, I do understand the struggle to get that support sometimes. And food and environmental triggers can really change over time, even in the same year. Like I was saying about pollen season versus non-pollen season. If someone has an illness, for example, they may find they have to be on a much more restrictive diet straight afterwards rather than when they've recovered. So there's no single approach that works for everyone, but also no single approach for someone that works every single month of the year, which is why it's so confusing. And often people with MCAS might have had a co-diagnosis of something like irritable bowel syndrome, because MCAS can affect the gut so much. So often people have been put on diets like the low FODMAP diet. And then they have multiple diets in their head, and it can be really hard to sort of separate it all out. So keeping food and symptom diaries is probably the best way of doing it, and trying to separate and see patterns in what you're eating. So histamine is one of the chemicals that causes, or is thought to cause, the most symptoms with MCAS. So there are 2 enzymes that are involved in breaking down histamine in the body. The diamine oxidase is the enzyme that helps us primarily break down the histamine in the foods that we eat. And as well as your own mast cells producing lots of these chemicals and lots of histamine, for some people with MCAS, the enzyme in the gut might not work as well as it should in terms of breaking it down. And there's also histamine produced by gut bacteria. So some people may have an imbalance of gut bacteria, which causes their gut bacteria to produce lots of excess histamine. So taking DAO enzymes may be helpful for some people experiencing the symptoms of histamine intolerance in MCAS. So for some patients, it might help minimize symptoms after foods such as migraines and gastro symptoms and urticaria. That was based on quite small trials. But it also might help some people expand their diet, so they might be able to go through and have more moderate histamine foods at certain times. But it's really important to remember that histamine is only one of these chemicals, so it's not going to cure all symptoms, but it might be a helpful tool for some people. So there's lots and lots of high histamine foods. There's no gold standard list, which can be really difficult. So some of you might already be following a low histamine diet, but you might all be using different lists. So there is no one that's 100% right and one that's 100% wrong. The histamine content of food varies based on how it's stored, how it's cooked. how long it's been in your fridge, so many different factors. The most common lists I see are the Swiss, the SIGI list. One that's really helpful that looks at other food chemicals is the RPAH list from Australia. And then there's the British Dietetic Association list. I think that, you know, the trouble with the low histamine diet is all these foods are really socially used. So tomatoes are in absolutely everything, especially if eating out, chocolates, cheeses, cured meats, strawberries. So it's really, really important to find out what you can eat rather than what you can't. And that's why that reintroduction process is so, so important, and looking at that overall histamine bucket. For example, some of you might be able to, you know, eat out and have a slightly higher histamine meal if you've kept your bucket lower during the week. Some of you absolutely might not, depending on the stage of your MCAS journey and how stable you are. But it's helpful to have an awareness of foods that are high histamine. And there are consensus over which ones are higher. So fermented foods, which are really trendy at the moment, are higher histamine. Aged meats, leftovers, the longer it's left out after cooking, the more histamine it's going to contain. So there's lots of top tips on low histamine, and this is all in the self-management tool that Mast Cell Action recently released on their website. So tips for things like shopping and storing foods. Freezing foods can actually slow the production of histamine, so often I encourage people to freeze leftovers right away and then use it, defrost it on the day of use. Also, if you were shopping in a supermarket and you plan to eat the meat, you know, a week later, then actually freezing it when you buy it and then defrosting before use can be helpful. Some people, you know, use butchers and talk to them about when the meat was slaughtered and how fresh it is. There's lots of different things that you can do. So yeah, that's all on the self-management tool if you wanted to have a look. Eating on a budget MCAS can be really expensive because all the medication, all the money you might spend on, you know, private doctors, medications, supplements. So eating on a budget can be really, really important. So cooking in bulk and making your own low histamine ready meals. Chicken mince can often be cheaper than beef and lamb mince, and I had a lot of questions about this last time because some lists say that mince can be higher than whole bits of meat because there's more surface area for the bacteria to degrade the histidine to histamine. But some people can tolerate mince, so it's something that I do still use at home. So my husband's been following a low histamine diet for 6 years and he can tolerate it, so we do cook meals with mince. Bulking up meals with frozen low histamine vegetables, and making your own sort of favorite takeaways at home, which can be much easier because some of you might have already tried getting takeaways on a low histamine diet. It can be really, really challenging, much more challenging than, for example, I follow a gluten-free diet, and you know, there's often menus for me, but my husband goes to a takeaway or a restaurant and there's not a low histamine menu. So actually making things at home like takeaways can be enjoyable and much easier. Eating out on a low histamine diet, so again, like I just explained, it can be tricky. People don't necessarily understand what a low histamine diet is, so knowing what foods you can and can't eat can be really helpful. So looking at menus in advance to see if there are any suitable meals for your dietary needs. There's often some different restaurants that are easier than others. For example, a pub might be easier than an Italian restaurant where there's tomatoes in absolutely everything. And speaking to your friends and family about your dietary needs and picking the venue yourself, so you feel more in control, because if you're already getting stressed about going out to eat and you already are preempting what's going to happen, that can obviously add to your histamine and add to the chemicals that are in your body. And managing that can be really, really difficult when you might have had a really stressful experience in a restaurant in the past. And that's kind of how we identified that my husband was having reactions, it was whenever we went out for dinner, and he was almost passing out after dinner, and yeah. So traveling on a low histamine diet. So lots of people that I see quite early in their MCAS journey, you know, stress about the fact that they don't feel confident traveling anymore, and that was something they enjoyed. Self-catering holidays might help to control what you're eating much more. All-inclusives might be a bit more challenging. Making sure you have plenty of safe snacks in your suitcases. Airports can be difficult. Making sure you've got safe foods with you, and making sure you have your medications, and trying to reduce these external triggers such as stress as much as possible. I say that really tongue-in-cheek because anyone that's been to Gatwick knows it's really stressful. and foreign airports as well. So top tips for low histamine. So there can be hidden histamines in things. So often people don't know sometimes where that excess histamines come from, and it might just be that it's crept in throughout the week. So yeast extract seems to be in absolutely everything. So in things like crisps and sauces and stocks and gravies, and on its own it might not be a problem. If you've had it in every meal every single day, it might just fill that back up. Things like tomato powders, vinegars, aged meat. So the longer a steak is aged, that the more histamine it's going to contain, and things like leftovers and soy sauce. So the difficulties commonly faced are the struggle to find reliable information. There's loads and loads of different lists online. They all say different things. If you follow every single one, you're going to be on a really, really limited diet. And it can be really socially and nutritionally restrictive if it's not well planned. And often, because of the nature of MCAS, people are so fatigued, so tired, often are not able to cook and to shop the way they would like to. Actually, we're saying, you know, cook fresh, and actually that's not always possible, and that can be really difficult. And individuals are likely to need other tools in their toolbox as well, so things like medications, you know, stress management, and the things that I'll talk about later. It can also feel really isolating and that no one understands the diet or the condition. I know my husband's felt like he's, you know, seen as fussy at times, when that's absolutely not the case. He loves food, but, you know, the reactions are so bad, it can make him feel really isolated and like he's not able to enjoy social occasions. However, as his MCAS has become much more stable, that feeling has reduced. And eating out and traveling, but you can absolutely enjoy those things. It's just finding other ways around it. So overcoming those difficulties is the most important thing, and finding ways to do the things that you love. So with the low histamine diet, finding a dietitian who can support you with the diet. There's also some great accounts on Instagram that are really positive and show how you can travel with chronic illness, and Low Histamine Kitchens on Instagram, and also has a website called Through the Fibro Fog, and it's got loads and loads of recipes on there. So it's run by a lady who has MCAS herself, and there's loads of different recipes for different diets, so vegan, vegetarian, gluten-free, but also low histamine meals as well as that. And then Mast Cell Action has just launched the self-management kit that I helped with, and that's got loads of stuff like tips for traveling, tips for eating out, and recipes. And Mast Cell Action are running loads of stuff to help with the feeling of isolation, so community Zoom sessions, weekly Qigong sessions. Did I also see a yoga session, Joy?
Yeah, we've got a yoga session tomorrow. It's a trial session, and then if it goes well, we're hoping that we'll get some funding to be able to do them weekly from September.
Amazing. So yeah, there's loads of stuff that Mast Cell Action are doing that you can get involved in to help with that feeling of isolation. I think the more we talk about it and the more you have others that you can talk about it with, the less isolating it can feel. So I always hate talking about these slides because there's so many different lists and you're all going to be following different ones. So it's really to prove that there are lots of meals that you can do. And it does take much more planning. There is no getting around that. So we often do, you know, a huge meal plan on a Sunday night, end up doing our shop. But it does take much more planning than before. So there are many breakfasts that you can have no matter what your list. Eggs, so on the RPH, the Australian list, all eggs are fine. So both parts of the eggs are fine. So some people can tolerate things like omelettes and scrambled eggs, bowls of porridge in the winter, with any low histamine fruit, some breakfast cereals, you know, avoiding really chocolatey ones, or sometimes barley malt extract if you have a sensitivity to that. But there are lots of breakfasts that are suitable depending on your dietary restrictions. And then lunches, things like homemade soup. So often we batch cook and freeze it just so we've got something that we can grab and go. No tomato sauces were an absolute game changer for us. So we found that when we had to go to histamine, that actually, you know, everything we used was tomato. So finding a sauce that we could use instead. The one is our kind of go-to is roasted red peppers, putting them in the oven, then mixing them with water and making that sauce. And we've used it in all sorts like chilies and spaghetti bologneses, and it can taste just as good. Things like that are quick and easy are things like sweet potato jacket potatoes or normal jacket potatoes with low histamine fillings. Also for some people, the pre-cooked quinoa or pre-cooked rice, yes, they might be higher histamine than freshly cooked rice. However, some of my clients are so fatigued, actually, that can be really convenient for them, and it might not be enough histamine to overflow their bucket. So it is finding other ways around it. And evening meals, so things like spaghetti bolognese, so family friendly meals that you can do and you could serve to the rest of your family if you are low histamine. Things like chicken goujons and chips and vegetables, chicken sausages, mash and leeks, and then roast dinners. So there are usually ways of adapting meals to make them lower histamine. It's just finding ways to do that. But obviously I acknowledge that some people will be on much more restrictive diets than what are on the page, and it's trying to find a way to get back more to normality, or what normality was. So this is the low histamine or MCAS toolbox. So it just talks about all of the things that might help come together to help with the condition. So making sure you have a healthy, balanced diet. So actually, if you end up on quite a limited diet, that can cause vitamin and mineral deficiencies, which might make the condition worse. So trying to find, ways you can rebalance that. Prescribable or over-the-counter medications, looking at dietary modifications. Sometimes that's adding foods back in, sometimes that's taking foods away. Probiotics, like I said briefly before, some gut bacteria can produce histamine and some can help us break it down. So actually some probiotics can actually make histamine intolerance worse, and some might make it better. So it's choosing the ones that might be helpful. Identifying and avoiding environmental triggers. Stress management is huge. Often flare-ups can coincide with stress, and I think Mast Cell Action are doing a mind and MCAS talk. Is it in the next couple of days, Joy?
Yeah, it's on Thursday. So I'll pop the link in the chat in a minute for that if anybody wants to come along.
I really want to come along. I think it looks amazing.
Come along. Yeah, it's MCAS and your mind, and it's really, there's some great stuff in it. We've got a wonderful volunteer, Deborah, coming along to host the session, and yeah, it's looking really great. So I definitely recommend it based on what I've seen is going to be included.
And I know there's some doctors that one specific doctor that's looking at things like cognitive behavioral therapy. to try and help with the stress side of MCAS, because obviously MCAS causes stress itself, and then the more stress you get, the more chemicals are released. So it's a really, really vicious cycle. And then I know other people are looking at things like gut-directed hypnotherapy, which are currently used for irritable bowel syndrome, and they're looking at whether that might work with MCAS symptoms as well. So I think there's some interesting things that are coming along for that, but things like qigong and yoga and anything like that can help calm the mind is going to be helpful for that stress management side. And then the DOA supplements, but only for some people.
So obviously we know there's a link between long COVID and MCAS, and we started to realise that when people from the long COVID groups, or people who've had long COVID, started to come to the Mast Cell Action and tell us that, you know, they think they've now got MCAS and there's a lot of overlap in the symptoms. So it's now believed that following a COVID-19 infection, the symptoms that people are experiencing could be MCAS. So we know that there's an overlap with the symptoms, and we know that medicines that help with MCAS also help with some long COVID symptoms. We obviously know that mast cells are activated by COVID because that's them completing their normal response. And so mast cells may be a driver of inflammation following an infection of COVID-19. So it has been proposed that an assessment for MCAS could be considered if you're experiencing those allergic type or inflammatory symptoms experienced with long COVID. So what's the next step? If you suspect you have MCAS, what should you do? Well, the first thing that we recommend is keeping a diary or tracking your symptoms, including videos and photographs, include evidence of what's happening, so that when you speak to doctors, you can show them images of the reactions that you're having. You can give them as much detail as possible. We always recommend, especially at the beginning, that you don't contact your GP and tell them that you think you have MCAS, or contact specialists and tell them that you think you have MCAS, but start with the symptoms, because doctors need that time to process information and to follow their journey to see if they can support. And, you know, if we get to a point further down the line where perhaps they haven't got the answers, that may be the time to have that conversation where you bring MCAS up and start to have that conversation around it. But actually, if you can get some relief for some of your symptoms, then you may find that that helps with your stability and your quality of life, even prior to having a diagnosis. A lot of people will have a suggested MCAS or suspected MCAS diagnosis rather than an actual MCAS diagnosis initially. And we know that people struggle often on the NHS, and that you may end up in a private clinic if you're in a position to be able to do that. But the support for the symptoms, we hope that you'll be able to get with your GP or with consultants by raising what those specific symptoms are. Please direct them to our website. There's information there designed for doctors to share research and explain what's happening physiologically with the body and MCAS, and also information about testing and treatment, so that they are able to best support you if they're interested. Also, feel free to put them in touch with us if you've got a doctor who's interested or another health professional who's interested. Please do put them in touch. We're always happy to connect them with other experts or to do our best to support them wherever we can. You can always contact us by email. If we can't help, we'll tell you, but you know, we will help you with whatever we can. So please do get in touch with us. So who are Mast Cell Action? I'm aware that some of you have only recently become aware of us, but actually we've been here beavering away in the background for quite some time. So Mast Cell Action was created in December 2015 by 3 people, 2 who had MCAS and 1 who cares for somebody with MCAS. And they realised that there wasn't really any support out there for people like us. So our vision is a world where everyone affected by mast cell disease has their symptoms acknowledged, their experiences listened to, and that they achieve a correct diagnosis and receive the care and support that they need. And everything we do is to help improve the lives of people affected by MCAS. So there's lots of different services and resources that we're developing to try and support people. You know, we know, because most of us have MCAS or care for somebody with MCAS, how isolating it can be and what a difficult journey it can be. But lots of us have been very, very unwell, or have somebody in our lives who've been very, very unwell, and are now finding some stability or some improvement. And I think that's a really important message, that there is hope, that often it can feel that, you know, it's never going to get better. And I'll talk a bit more about my daughter at the end, because I think that's really, really helpful. So we've got some fantastic, if I do say so myself, self-management tools. So all of our tools and resources are available to download for free from our website. It needs a little bit of a tidy up, because at the moment we've just tried to get them on there so that they're available for you, but it does need some organising. So you might have to have a little hunt through the different resources pages. But there's lots of wellbeing resources, and then also our symptoms log and self-management resource, and our newly launched Freedom Kit. So if you have a child with MCAS, it's a pack which has been designed to help you share the needs of your child with the caregivers, so schools or clubs or anybody else who might be caring for your child, to explain what MCAS is and to help detail the specific needs that your child may have. And we're working on other resources, such as a resource for helping people in the workplace to ask for reasonable adjustments, and one for students. So there are lots of guides that are going to be coming out, which will hopefully really support you in day-to-day life. And if there's anything that's missing and you think this would be great, we love to hear from you. So please get in touch and tell us what would really make a difference to you and what we can put together. And if we can make it happen, then we will. So Chloe touched on some of the services that we offer. So we've got Qigong sessions, which are on a Monday at 2 p.m. every week. Come along for free. And Jen will teach you some amazing, very calm, inclusive exercises to help with stress relief and calming. And, you know, we have people coming along who tell us that it really has made a difference to their symptom management. So if you're available, do come and give those a try. I think there's some videos that are going to go up, just some tasters on the YouTube channel, and there's already a video of Jen on there talking about what Qigong is, if you're interested. We've also got loads of other bits and bobs on the YouTube and social media platforms. We have our weekly community sessions on a Thursday. As we mentioned this week, we've got a mindfulness session. So if you're interested in that, do come along. So there's general support sessions, and then sometimes there's themed sessions where there'll be a more specific conversation or somebody coming along to talk about something in particular. Our MCAS Voices group is our community group where people can help us to steer projects, make decisions about the resources that we develop, give us feedback, trial different resources. So please feel free to join that. There's information on our website. Casper is our chameleon who has MCAS. It's a storybook about a chameleon who is feeling pretty down in the dumps because he's got MCAS and he can't join in with his friends so much as he'd like to, and he's having lots of different symptoms that aren't very pleasant. And then with each page of the book there is a card which was developed with a CBT therapist and a children's play therapist to help talk through some of those difficult conversations and help explain some of those things to children who may be affected by MCAS. You can order the pack for free. There's information on the website about how to do that. We've obviously talked about the self-management resource. That again is available to download on the website. You can join our Facebook support groups. I'll try and pop the links in the chat for those shortly. And yoga. So we have a yoga session tomorrow. I think you can still book on. We are needing to ask for a donation for that session, which is £2.50, just to help cover some of the costs. But we are applying for some funding, and if we get it, we'll be able to do a weekly session for free. Oh, excuse me, for free. So we hope to see you at some of those sessions. And then these are just our contact details. Again, these will all be included on the email that I send out. Feel free to follow us. We've got some great campaigns on our social media channels with, MCAS moments where people talk about what it feels like to have MCAS and the different moments for them that are really difficult and that they struggle with, or the I Feel campaign where we share, some of those really difficult feelings like guilt that people might be experiencing and open some conversations around those. And we've got our Facebook support group. So for parents, there's a group where families can talk about children with MCAS, and then there's an adult support group. Parents are also welcome in there. It's a much more active group. And of course, I just have to mention, if you would like to donate or fundraise for Mast Cell Action, we would be delighted to have your support. We are a really small charity, mainly led by volunteers. And there is so much more that we want to do. So what we've seen in the last sort of 3 or 4 months is an explosion of hard work that's been happening over the last couple of years. But the more support that we have, the more that we'll be able to deliver much more quickly. So if you are in a position to support, or you fancy going for a run or doing a bake-off or anything exciting or fabulous or different, then just get in touch. We'll send you out a free t-shirt, and we'd love to talk to you about how we can support you to support us. And that brings us to our questions. So I'm just going to stop share